You'd think after serving 12 years in the Army and working night shifts in the ER, I'd be used to dealing with people who think they're above the rules. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for the HOA in Brookstone Ridge, especially not for Marlene Whitmore, the board president with a resting glare and a voice like nails on a chalkboard. It started on a Thursday morning. I'd just finished a brutal 12-hour shift and parked my black Tacoma in my own driveway, not the street, not someone else's spot. My driveway. I staggered inside, kicked off my boots, and collapsed into bed. When I woke up 6 hours later, groggy and sore, I stepped outside to grab a package off the porch and my truck was gone. I stood there blinking, thinking maybe I'd lost my mind. I walked up and down my driveway. Nothing. No broken glass, no tire tracks, just empty concrete and a weird oil stain where the truck had been. I checked my Ring camera footage. Sure enough, at 10:42 a.m. a tow truck rolled up, hooked up my Tacoma like it was abandoned junk and drove off. No notice, no sticker, no call. And standing at the edge of my lawn, arms crossed like a gargoyle on caffeine, was Marlene Whitmore herself, nodding in approval as the driver hauled my truck away. I was pissed. I stormed over to her house, still in my sweatpants and half asleep, and banged on her door. She opened it like she'd been expecting me, wearing a pastel cardigan and holding a clipboard like it was a weapon. "Can I help you, Mr. Sutter?" she said with a sugary tone that made my skin crawl. "You towed my truck," I said. "From my own driveway." She raised an eyebrow. According to the HOA bylaws, vehicles may not be parked in driveways for more than 6 non-consecutive hours during daylight. That's not a law, that's something you typed up on Microsoft Word. "It's enforceable," she said. "And you were warned." "I never got a warning." "I placed a notice on your door last month." "No, you didn't," she actually had the nerve to shrug. "Well, perhaps it blew away. Either way, the board voted. The vehicle violated aesthetic standards." "Aesthetic standards," I said. "It's a Tacoma, not a rusted-out hearse," she smiled. It clashed with the visual harmony of the neighborhood. I wanted to rip that clipboard in half. Instead, I walked away because I wasn't going to yell, I wasn't going to punch drywall. I was going to do what I do best: document everything and make her regret thinking she could mess with the wrong guy. I spent the next 2 days digging. First, I got the tow company's information from the footage and called them. They gave me the invoice, $225, paid by the HOA under an account linked to Brookstone Ridge Community Enforcement. I paid to get my truck back, but kept every receipt, timestamp, and call log. Then I pulled the HOA bylaws. Marlene wasn't lying about the 6 hours rule, except it was buried in a subsection labeled temporary construction equipment. Nowhere did it say personal vehicles could be towed without written notice or a hearing. That's when I knew I had her. I also found something even better: a clause in our state's property code that made unauthorized towing a misdemeanor unless the vehicle was obstructing traffic, which mine wasn't. It also required a posted notice, a warning sticker, and a chance to contest before removal. Marlene had skipped every single one of those steps. That weekend, I filed a civil complaint with the county clerk and attached every piece of evidence. I wasn't just going after the HOA, I was going after her personally, and since she authorized the tow, she was liable, but I wasn't done yet. I went door to door and talked to my neighbors. Turns out I wasn't the only one. A retired teacher named Miss Evelyn had her Buick towed for being too beige. A single mother down the street got a fine for having a baby stroller on her porch. The HOA had gone rogue, and Marlene was the queen of the nonsense. By the end of the week, I had 11 affidavits and 2 video recordings of her giving verbal commands to the tow driver without any documentation. The best part: my next-door neighbor, Hector, was a paralegal. He helped me file for a temporary restraining order against the HOA's towing actions, and the judge granted it within 48 hours. That meant no more towing until the matter was resolved in court. I printed out the order and taped it to my truck windshield. Then I parked right in the driveway front and center. The next morning, I caught Marlene standing across the street, arms folded, squinting at the piece of paper like it was in a foreign language. She marched over. "You think this little stunt is going to work?" I leaned against my truck. "It's not a stunt, Marlene. It's a court order. You tow another car and you're in violation of state law." "This is my community," she snapped. "No," I said. "This is our community, and you don't get to play dictator." She turned red like steam out the ears red and stormed off. That afternoon, she sent out a mass email to all HOA members claiming I was harassing board members and jeopardizing the harmony of the neighborhood. But by then, the tide was turning. People were tired of her nonsense. I had the support of half the block, and the other half was quietly cheering me on. Then, just when I thought she might back off, Marlene made the biggest mistake of her life. She towed another car, not just any car, Hector's, and this time I had everything on camera. Hector's car was a deep red BMW coupe, freshly waxed and parked perfectly parallel to his garage, not an inch over the sidewalk, not blocking anything. When I saw the empty slab of concrete outside his place, I didn't need to check the camera. I already knew, but I did it anyway. The footage was even worse than I expected. At 11:03 a.m., the same tow truck that had taken my Tacoma rolled up again, tires screeching like it owned the street. The driver didn't even hesitate. No chalk marks. No stickers. Just backed up, hooked up the beamer, and peeled out. And there she was again, Marlene standing under her ridiculous striped parasol, arms behind her back like she was inspecting a military drill. She watched the car disappear, then turned and walked away like it was just another chore on her list. What she didn't see was Hector watching from his upstairs window, phone in hand, recording the whole thing. By the time I knocked on his door an hour later, he already had 3 printed copies of the footage, a notarized affidavit, and a folder of HOA bylaws with every relevant section highlighted. He handed it to me without a word. "I'm done playing nice," he said, eyes locked on mine. We drove to the station together. The officer at the front desk raised an eyebrow when we explained what happened. But once we showed him the footage, the tone shifted. He called in a supervisor. Then another officer. Within 20 minutes, a detective named Rios sat us down in a small office and closed the door. "You're telling me this woman ordered a private towing company to remove personal vehicles from residential driveways without notice, hearings, or legal grounds," he said. "Twice," I said. "That we know of. There could be more." Hector slid over the folder. "She signed off on both removals. No written warnings, no traffic obstruction, no safety concerns, all caught on camera." Rios leaned back in his chair, flipping through the documents. "This isn't just a civil matter anymore. Unauthorized towing under false pretenses, especially from private property, this is criminal mischief. Possibly grand theft auto if the intent was malicious. She's been doing it under the guise of HOA authority," Hector added. "But she's bypassing the very procedures the board is supposed to follow." Rios nodded slowly. "You've got enough here to open an investigation." 2 hours later, a formal case was opened. The tow company was contacted. Their driver was brought in for questioning. Turns out, Marlene had been feeding them verbal instructions and paying them from the HOA's discretionary maintenance fund. No invoices, no meeting records, no board votes. She hadn't just overstepped. She'd lied, stolen, and misused community funds. That night, I called Evelyn, the retired teacher, and let her know. Then I called the single mother and the others who'd signed affidavits. We set up a gathering at Hector's house. It wasn't a meeting, it was a war council. We had 10 people in his living room, each with their own story, their own documents. One guy, Kevin, said he'd been fined for incompatible mailbox color, even though his had been the same shade of brown since the 90s. Another woman, Dana, had been cited for excessive wind chimes. Marlene had turned the HOA into a personal fiefdom, using trivialities to punish anyone who didn't smile and nod. "I think it's time we put her out of business," Hector said. I pulled out a copy of the HOA's Articles of Incorporation. "We can. This board isn't a monarchy. We have the numbers to call a special election and vote her out. But she won't go quietly, Evelyn said. She'll challenge every vote. Then we make it airtight, I said. We follow every bylaw. We contact the state HOA oversight agency. And we bring in an independent observer. She can't fight all of us. Meanwhile, Detective Rios wasn't wasting time. By the following Tuesday, he had enough to obtain a warrant. The HOA office, really just a converted bedroom in Marlene's home, was searched. What they found blew the doors off everything. She'd kept handwritten logs of fines she issued, many of which never made it into the official HOA system. There were checks written to herself labeled as consulting fees and enforcement bonuses. Over 50 envelopes of cash, tucked away in file cabinets, were traced back to cash-only settlements she had demanded from residents in exchange for dismissing fines. And then, the clincher. A forged letterhead with a fake legal advisory from a non-existent community compliance consultant that she'd used to intimidate residents into compliance. All of it documented, stamped, and bagged. The police arrested her that Thursday morning. I watched from my porch as they walked her out in cuffs, still in her floral robe, yelling about reputation damage and neighborhood sabotage. Her husband stood uselessly in the doorway, stunned. A few neighbors peeked from behind curtains. Others came out and watched openly. No one said a word. No one tried to stop it. Later that afternoon, the interim board, the 3 remaining members who'd been left in the dark, called an emergency meeting. They were apologetic, embarrassed, and overwhelmed, but they authorized our petition for a full board re-election. We had enough signatures within 24 hours. Hector ran for treasurer, Evelyn for secretary. I ran for president. Marlene's name was removed from all HOA documents. Her access to accounts was terminated. The tow company terminated their contract and issued a public apology. They claimed they'd been misled and unaware of the improper authorizations. The driver was fired. At the town hall meeting held in the community center, I stood at a podium in front of over 50 neighbors. The energy in the room was electric, tense, hopeful, ready for change. I didn't move here to be policed, I said. None of us did. We moved here to live in peace, to take care of our homes and our families, and we are going to take our neighborhood back, fairly, transparently, together. The crowd erupted into applause. The election was held 2 weeks later. We won in a landslide. The first thing we did was pass a motion banning any towing actions without at least 72 hours' notice and written approval from the full board. Then we froze all discretionary spending until a full audit could be completed. As for Marlene, she was charged with misuse of funds, falsifying documents, and unlawful towing, among other counts. Her trial date was set for the fall. When her attorney tried to argue that she had acted in the best interest of the neighborhood, the judge cut him off and reminded the court that authority without accountability is tyranny. We didn't just get our vehicles back, we got our community back. And as I stood on my driveway one early morning, sipping coffee and watching the sun rise over a neighborhood finally free of her grip, I couldn't help but think some fights are worth every ounce of energy. Because sometimes, the only way to deal with bullies in cardigans is to drag their clipboard-loving selves straight into the light, and let the law do the rest. 3 weeks after the election, the neighborhood looked different. Not physically, houses still cast the same shadows across the cul-de-sacs, and the same wind rustled the elm trees, but there was a shift in the air. People walked slower, waved more. Some even brought lawn chairs out in the evenings. It felt like the place had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. But the work wasn't over. On a brisk Tuesday morning, Hector and I sat in the community center's back office, now converted into the HOA's temporary headquarters. The space had once been used to store folding chairs and Christmas decorations, but now it held a printer, a second-hand filing cabinet, and a stack of sealed boxes labeled audit evidence. Evelyn walked in holding a manila envelope, her brow furrowed. "This came in from the county clerk's office," she said. They sent over the ledger from the HOA's bank account, and there's something off. I slid it open and pulled out the statement. The numbers didn't make sense. Deposits and withdrawals didn't match up with any of the invoices we'd seen. Hector leaned in, tapping one entry. "Look at this," he said. "5,000 for landscaping enhancement. That was 2 months ago, but we didn't hire any contractors until last week." I checked the next page. Another payment, 4,000, labeled security fee. But there had never been security services in our neighborhood. No patrols, no sentries, not even a neighborhood watch sign on the corner. Evelyn sat down, rubbing her temples. She was funneling money out. We knew about the cash envelopes, but this is structured fraud. She created fake vendors. Hector picked up the phone and dialed Detective Rios. By the time we finished explaining, Rios asked us to bring the documents directly to the precinct. He sounded tired but focused. Like a man who'd expected one rat and uncovered a nest. That afternoon, we met him in a small interview room. He wore a gray short-sleeve button-down with a badge clipped to his belt and a legal pad already half filled with notes. "These vendor payments," he said, flipping through the ledger, "none of them have tax ID numbers, no business licenses, and the checks were all cashed within 48 hours. That tells me someone was either laundering funds or cutting checks to friends." I leaned forward. "We think she created shell companies, or maybe used relatives. We'll subpoena the routing numbers," he said. "If those checks ended up in a personal account, that's bank fraud, wire fraud too, if any of this moved through interstate systems." Evelyn crossed her arms. "What are we looking at?" "In terms of charges, depends on how many transactions we can prove were fraudulent," said Rios. "If the total exceeds 25,000, it escalates to a felony under state law. Combine that with the forged documents from her house, and we're looking at multiple felony counts." Hector nodded slowly. "She's going to prison, isn't she?" Rios didn't answer right away. He just kept writing. 2 days later, the warrant was issued for financial records. The HOA's bank complied immediately, and by the following Monday, we had a full breakdown of 5 years' worth of transactions. That's when we found the worst of it. A payment for $10,000, labeled Community Recreation Upgrade, had been issued to a company called Verd Solutions. A quick search showed no such business registered in the state, but Marlene's sister-in-law had a company with a similar name. Different spelling. Same address as one of the check endorsements. We brought it to Rios. He made 2 calls and had a financial crimes investigator join the case. By the end of the week, the DA's office was involved. The indictment came fast. 8 counts of wire fraud, 3 counts of embezzlement, 1 count of conspiracy to commit fraud, and a civil suit filed by the HOA membership for restitution. Marlene's attorney filed a motion to dismiss, claiming the charges were overblown and personal in nature. The judge denied it in under 10 minutes. The trial date was set for the following quarter. In the meantime, we held our own internal review meetings, going page by page through every expenditure. We uncovered more fabricated charges, including a bizarre one labeled Pest Control Emergency Bat Containment. Not only had there never been bats, but the invoice was made out by hand and signed by D. Whitmore. Marlene's husband, Hector, laughed when he saw it. She couldn't even fake a business name for that one. Evelyn circled the signature. They were treating the HOA like a family ATM. Our next move was to implement full transparency reforms. We passed a rule requiring all expenses over $100 to be approved in a public meeting. We hired an actual CPA to conduct monthly audits, and we launched a community portal where residents could track every dollar. People started attending meetings again, not out of fear or frustration, but out of interest. They brought snacks. They cracked jokes. One guy even brought a guitar and played after the meeting ended. The neighborhood had come back to life. But Marlene wasn't done trying to claw her way out. 2 weeks before her trial, we received a letter from her new attorney, some big-name firm she must have hired with the last of her squirreled-away funds. The letter accused the HOA of defamation and demanded a cease and desist on our public communications about the trial. We handed it to Rios. He read it over once, then chuckled without humor. She's trying to intimidate you into silence, but once charges are public record, it's not defamation, it's documentation. We posted the court's press release on the community bulletin board, along with a copy of the cease and desist letter. The community response was swift and unified. Dozens of homeowners wrote letters to the DA's office, thanking them for their work and offering witness statements. On the morning of the trial, I walked into the courthouse wearing a collared shirt and slacks. Hector and Evelyn flanked me. We didn't speak much in the hallway, just exchanged nods. Inside, Marlene sat at the defense table in a navy blazer and pearls, looking like she'd walked out of a catalog shoot, but her eyes were hollow. She looked smaller than I remembered, and not just physically. Like someone who'd finally realized the walls had closed in, the prosecution opened with a simple statement. This case is not about selective enforcement. It is not about neighborhood disagreements. It is about a woman who used her position of trust to steal from an entire community, fabricate authority, and weaponize fear. They laid out the forged invoices, the bank transfers, the faked consultant letters, and the video of her authorizing unauthorized tows without documentation. Her defense tried to spin it, arguing she acted under pressure, made mistakes, and never intended personal gain. But the evidence was overwhelming. By the third day, her attorney requested a plea deal. She pled guilty to 3 counts of fraud and agreed to pay restitution totaling $38,000. Her sentence, 2 years in county, followed by 5 years probation. She was also banned from holding any HOA-related position for life. In the hallway after sentencing, Evelyn turned to me. "I feel like I can finally breathe," I nodded. "It's over." But as we walked out into the sunlight, I realized something. It wasn't just about getting justice for a towed truck. It was about proving that no one, not even someone with a clipboard and a title, gets to rewrite the rules for their own benefit. Not while we're watching, and not in this neighborhood. The morning after sentencing, I stood in front of the community center, key in hand, ready to unlock the storage room that had been sealed during the investigation. This was the last piece of unfinished business boxes of untouched paperwork, some dating back nearly a decade, all left behind when Marlene's reign ended. No one had dared go through it until the legal dust settled. Evelyn arrived first, carrying a thermos of black coffee and a determined look. Hector followed, pulling a dolly stacked with file bins he'd picked up from the office supply store. We didn't speak much as we got to work, gloves on, dust thick in the air. 40 minutes in, Evelyn let out a sharp breath. "I found something," she said, holding up a padded envelope, larger than the rest, with a single word scrawled across the front in red marker. "Archive." Inside were photocopies of checks, not recent ones, but older, faded, and stamped with names none of us recognized. The amounts weren't massive, several hundred here, 1,000 there, but what stood out was the memo line. Repeated phrases: noise violation settlement, tree overgrowth citation dismissal, pet restriction compensation. "What the hell is this?" Hector asked, flipping through the stack. "These aren't fines, these are payouts," I said. She was taking bribes. Evelyn turned a sheet toward me. "No, these were from residents. These are payments to the HOA, well, to her, so she wouldn't enforce penalties." We stood in silence for a moment. "She sold immunity," Hector muttered. "She turned the HOA into a black market." That was when we decided to go back through the digital records, particularly the years before the two of us had moved in. Hector pulled up the archived emails and minutes on his laptop and cross-referenced them with the names on the checks. It didn't take long to spot the pattern. Residents who made these payments never received follow-up violations. Several had been noted as compliant in unrelated enforcement logs. A few hadn't even received board approval for major renovations, yet somehow their plans had gone through without delay. I called Detective Rios again. When he arrived later that afternoon, we laid everything out across the conference table. He scanned the checks, the dates, the names, and his expression darkened. These weren't just bribes. If the payments influenced board actions and were undocumented, that's racketeering territory, he said. And if even one of these payments came from someone coerced or misled, we're dealing with extortion. He left with the files. 3 days later, the DA reopened the case not to retry Marlene, but to investigate who else might have been involved. Her husband was already under scrutiny, but this opened a new can of worms. Rios called me the next week. His voice was sharp, urgent. We need to talk, not just about the board, about the tow company. I met him at the precinct. He handed me a folder with state vehicle impound records. The company Marlene had used Garrison Recovery had a pattern of towing vehicles from multiple suburban developments under questionable circumstances. In at least 2 other neighborhoods, residents reported similar behavior. No notice, no documentation, sudden demands for cash-only releases. They weren't just sloppy, Rios said. They were complicit. He explained that Marlene had entered into a verbal agreement with the owner, a man named Dwayne Garrison, in which she'd authorized tows, and he'd kick back a portion of the impound fees under the table. No paper trail, just cash in hand. She got a percentage, I asked. 15% of every vehicle towed. That includes storage fees. We have a statement from one of his former drivers, Rios said. This wasn't an enforcement action. This was a predatory towing ring. The DA filed new charges against Garrison and subpoenaed his company's transaction logs. Within days, several HOA board members from other neighborhoods came forward, claiming they'd been approached by him with similar offers. 2 admitted to accepting them. One had already fled the state. It was bigger than our block. It was a network. The state attorney general's office took over. Back at Brookstone Ridge, we held a special meeting, no formality, no agenda, just a gathering of residents under the string lights someone had hung in the courtyard. People brought lawn chairs and folding tables. Someone set out lemonade. For the first time since everything had started, I saw real relief on people's faces. This could have gone on for years if no one had pushed back, Hector told me as we stood near the edge of the crowd. I just wanted my truck back, I said. Didn't expect to find a criminal enterprise hiding behind manicured lawns. Funny how that works, Evelyn said, joining us. You know, I used to think HOAs were just bureaucratic overkill. Turns out, they can be dangerous in the wrong hands. The next week, the Attorney General gave a press conference. The investigation had officially expanded into a multi-county probe of illegal towing, extortion, and fraud by HOA board members colluding with private businesses. Marlene's plea deal was amended. She'd agreed to testify against the others in exchange for a reduced sentence on the new charges. She was transferred to a secure facility. The rest of us just tried to move forward. That spring, we held a community cleanup, not because we were told to, but because people actually wanted to. Kids chalked the sidewalks. Hector and I installed a new notice board, this time digital, with open access. Evelyn started a community newsletter. She called it The Ridge Report. The first issue featured a full breakdown of new HOA policies, a spotlight on the local gardener who donated time to restore the flower beds, and a section titled Know Your Rights. We had transparency now, real oversight. And a neighborhood that had learned the hard way how important both were. One afternoon, I walked past the spot where my truck had been towed. The oil stain was gone. Someone had power washed the driveway. I paused, hands in my pockets, and looked around at the quiet street, the laughter of kids echoing from 2 houses over. A man I hadn't met before stepped out of a moving van across the street. He waved at me. "Hey, you live here?" "Yeah," I said, crossing over. "Welcome to Brookstone Ridge," he nodded, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Any advice for a new guy?" I smiled. "Read the bylaws, come to meetings. And if someone tells you you can't park in your own driveway, call me," he laughed, shaking his head. "Sounds like a story there." Oh, there is, I said, but let's just say the people who ran things before, they don't anymore. As I walked back to my house, I felt it settle in for the first time, not just victory, but peace. The kind you earn, not the kind enforced by people with clipboards and too much free time. We'd taken our neighborhood back, and now it belonged to the people who actually lived in it.